All right, without further ado, let's give a round of applause to Tyrone and Alison.
Hi, Tyrone.
Hey, Alison, how are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm okay, thanks.
You're back in Ohio?
Yes, yep,
Okay. Okay.
yep, made it back. Um, and Jay, thanks for pinch hitting, as it were, yesterday. Appreciate that. Um, so I had, I was reading through your work and so forth. So I actually had some very specific questions about specific poems of yours. Um, Particularly the ones that were published on the Poetry Foundation. And I know sometimes that, when we get work published, particularly in an outlet like that, it doesn't necessarily represent, first of all, what we're doing currently. Obviously, it doesn't, because these are from years ago, um, decades ago, and actually in one case, or in some cases. So, but nonetheless, thinking about the work that you've been working on lately, um, so the first one of the not the first, but one of the things I'm interested in is your relationship to what we might think of as a literary canon. And I'm thinking about this particularly in those two early poems of yours that rewrite T.S. Eliot, I think. Um, and I think there's even a reference to William Wordsworth and what the lyric be, which I find very interesting, and thinking that you're thinking about the lyric and what it is and what it can be and so forth, and particularly given that title. So can you talk a little bit about your relationship to the tradition, as we might think of it?
Yeah, I'm torn. Every morning before our residency has started, I've been taking a course through the Science History Institute on oral history, how to conduct oral histories, to get a certificate to be able to start taking oral histories of contemporary Black poets. And a lot of times when I do readings, people will refer to Eliot or Wordsworth or Hopkins. If I'm referring to any kind of white male canonical figures, that's often people's entry points, or they feel most comfortable asking me about those things. And so I am both interested in canon as a type of archive or a type of like Mount Rushmore, like these are the figureheads or these are the voices that we supposedly value or think are worth students having knowledge of or a relationship to. But but then when I get that question, I'm always bristled by it. So I'm trying to reconcile why I don't find that I think my relationship to grammar, even diagramming sentences or something was always one of failure. In high school, always had to go to my teachers. We had office hours at a certain time of the day to work through why I had failed yet another grammar exam. A key component of me dropping out of my PhD program in English literature was I could never pass the translation exams. And I needed to do it in two languages. So I was just like, you know what, it's a wrap for me. So when it comes to canon, I both engage with it and am interested by it, and I believe a lot of my work is collage like, or it's polyvocal in terms of speaking across space and time with a lot of different figureheads, but I'm also not that interested in it, or I'm skeptical or critical of what it means or what it might mean, or I process it more as a meditation on taste. Like we were talking in workshop yesterday about what it means to have a personal taste or to develop one's palate both literally or figuratively. So um, maybe I view members of the canon or canon as like a type of seasoning basis. Like if that's your salt and pepper, but I'm much more interested in like garlic powder. Other like I'm much more interested in other spices, curry, like much more drawn or interested in like integrating or creating unexpected maybe flavor profiles or unexpected pairings or juxtapositions, if you will.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I suspected that. I mean, I suspected that this was a way of as they say, clearing out space for yourself, sort of undermining these. So as you said, Mount Rushmore figures in order to create space for yourself. Um, so I don't know if that question, as you said, sometimes that question makes you bristle, but this one might actually make you bristle too, which is because I was, I mean, there's again thinking about some of the poems that I read of yours online. There's an interesting what's the word for it? I think tension. And this might just be between these two poems, but I'm interested in the question of how you negotiate in poetry the discussion of trauma or the issue of trauma and anger. And I'm thinking about this on two levels because for example, there are poems that really, really sort of go after the whole notion of motherhood as the natural destiny of females, right? But there's also a poem, and I'm trying to remember which one it is, that sort of raises that question of 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 um, of motherhood as a personal, desire outside of, if it's possible, to be outside of societal expectations and patriarchy and so forth. And so, and of course, and the poem, in fact, is Original Sin. That's what I'm thinking about. So it's an older poem of yours. But this question of, and you've sort of alluded to this during our workshop and actually in your reading too. How do you negotiate this, but not so much on a personal level, because that's personal, obviously, but in terms of the writing about it. I noticed, for example, that Don Lundy Martin, obviously in the box poem, is a figure that you quote, that you cite, and so forth. And of course, what's interesting for me is that she also talks a great deal, especially in the poem "Life," the book "Life is a Life in a Box is a Pretty Life." That particular book, the question of trauma and escape from that in the work. So how do you negotiate it when you're talking about that in the context of the work?
Yeah, I remember doing some of my earliest interviews after publishing, I guess, the collection in 2019, and showing up and smiling at people or being excited or gracious or wearing bright colors. And then I would be asked to read a couple poems. I would read the poems, maybe one of them would be Original Sin, and then people turning to me like, "Oh, those were so dark, those were so sad," or "Oh, such dark, like such traumatic content. You're you're so young, or you're so lively, you're so fun." Like these were very, and so I realized that there was this interesting dynamic taking place in terms of how trauma is supposed to sound, or how trauma is supposed to be represented, or one's expectation of performance of trauma depending on subject positions or identities. And having to grapple with the fact that I'm actually much more interested in pleasure and joy, or I find pleasure and joy more not just more desirable, but also more complex, or I find them more nuanced, I guess, in terms of my experience. And so but I realize that there's often a fetishization of trauma, or like at every AWP conference, there's almost always a panel on trauma. Or if I teach a workshop that's trauma based or centers trauma in the title, suddenly students are particularly invested in a certain way. And so there's something going on as it relates to trying to process anger, rage, frustration, resentment, pain, loss, grief. And at the same time, trying to find portals or entryways that allow for relief, or, in my opinion, a type of or form or texture of healing. I don't have like conclusive answers to that question, but something that I'm thinking a lot, especially in my nonfiction work, is about the concepts of suffering and survival. I think like Robert Hayden has this quote that I quote in the book, like all art is pain suffered and outlived, or
Right.
and so that there's this scene also in the film, The Five Heartbeats, and Robert Townsend's character like is in this kind of rhythm and blues group, and he's on stage and he's saying like he was told by a music exec that he'd be a better writer when he suffered more.
Right.
And so there's this notion that suffering, the pains artist is the best type of artist or produces the best type of work. And I don't want to live in that state, and I don't want to encourage or promote students to be living in that type of state consistently, at least. And so I'm always wrestling with that, I guess, that tension or dynamic. I was thinking last night after workshop, I was like, there's always this tension for me in terms of, to write, I feel like I'm the most confident. To imagine that someone would read anything I have to write requires me to be the most confident version of myself. And yet I'm often facing the utter despair of the opposite, which is why I do, like, it's constantly being kind of thrown in two separate directions that are at war, or kind of hard to navigate. And then I guess the last in what you said, I've been really interested, or one of my obsessions has been boxes, in all senses of the word, or construct, or dimensions of boxes. And when you said or mentioned motherhood, like motherhood is another one of those boxes conceptually that I'm very curious by. I would like to be, while being a cis woman, I think I'm actually more interested in how I could be a great father, and perhaps projecting or putting onto my partner how they, who are a cis man, how they could be a good mother. Like, I'm not really interested, or what constitutes motherhood, and what for me feels like a lot of societal pressures and expectations. How can I trouble, in fact, queer or problematize what that might mean or look like, is a more interesting project. Yeah. You use the word also escape, and I'm really interested in methods of escape. Loopholes, holes, like what are methods of sitting outside of a box, finding a crawl hole under the box, like tunneling around. Or I'm interested in, if one is to be subjected to a static location or certain aspects of identity, like what are the escape routes? What's the Underground Railroad to that subject positioning and out of? And I'm more interested in like tracing those routes than the static title, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. And in fact, when you were talking about trying to negotiate these various facets of your being, but also your various facets, the things that are pulling on you, outside yourself too. I thought about that remarkable essay, Birds of Prey, about your grandmother, and about, among other things, it's about forms of knowledge, right? Competing forms of knowledge, and your insistence on the fact that what might be considered alternative or marginal forms of knowledge are just as important, just as significant, and just as what's the word I'm looking for? Not durable, but Well, they have a certain degree of capacity in terms of allowing us to make our way through the world. And that's tied up, of course, in your interest in falconry, which you talk about in that essay. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? Because I think that essay really does sort of brings a lot of these issues together that you've been talking about.
Yeah, so I was a psychology major in undergrad, and I did a summer of research to explore what it might mean to be a doctoral student in psychology, and then decided against it. I'm also a very sensitive soul. I'm like a cliche Cancer. I'm very sensitive, and so I realized it just wasn't gonna be productive for me or other people for me to probably try to actually be a therapist or work in psychiatric type research. And but I'm always fascinated in terms of in what context things are seen as a syndrome or a disorder or some type of diagnoses that needs to be fixed or treated or changed, and in what other contexts that's suddenly a desirable thing or a thing that one is pursuing or wanting to embrace. And so in terms of these different types of knowledge like falconry and the study of birds, ornithology has been a playground for me in terms of my personal family mythology. My mother believes that her mother, who has passed away, lives on in the form of a hawk. So whenever she sees hawks, or I had the chance to take her to go see some hawks in a muse in Colorado Springs, but like she literally believes that these are manifestations or reincarnations of her mother. And it's a touch point. It's a way that we can be in communion with this person who's not living on this plane of existence. It gets tricky when you then go to meet with someone that's certified in falconry, or you go and spend the money to engage with falcons or something, and then suddenly it's like, this is a male bird, or this is actually a Harris hawk, or you don't know the difference between falcons and hawks, so you are therefore unqualified to speak about this. And part of what that essay explores is my mom, I'll say it in a crass way that she would never say, like, she doesn't give a fuck. Like, it doesn't, that value system or system of knowledge actually really isn't important. And for me, the underbelly of that is thinking about people's ways of processing love and the type of grief that I think is always interconnected to love, and the type of violences also that actually become embedded in love. Even despite us wanting to view perhaps violence and love as binaries or separate or opposite. And birds of prey overall have become another curious metaphor for me to explore that. Like I actually, in that very room, I did a presentation on apophenia. I remember a previous student, Cheryl, being like, oh, if your grandmother's a hawk, I can only imagine what she must be a really intense woman, or she must have been. And so people's perceptions about certain types of animals like wolves, bears, snakes, things that we've been socialized or trained to fear or try to control or even move to extinction or get rid of, figures that we've embraced in folklore as menacing. What does it mean to try to subvert or reimagine or transpose one's relationship to the dead onto those animal beings? I think, does that?
No, that's great. I mean, there's a lot there that in terms of what you were saying, particularly about the connection, of course, which you do explore in that, and not just in that essay, but in some of the poems too, the connection between love and violence and how those two things are in fact intimately, connected, as you just pointed out, not diametrically opposed to one another. Mm. Which of course is very counterintuitive in terms of traditional modes of knowledge and ways of seeing in the world. In that, I mean, just to sort of zoom out in the larger context of your writing in all forms, one of the things that you said in the poem "Free Radical," which I really like, well, I was wondering about, given some of the things that you say in that poem, and also object permanence. Again, these are older poems, but I wonder if, and in some ways you've answered this, I guess, is art, the creation of art, even possible or even desirable? Since, as you quote, and I'll just quote this line in one of the poems, the writing on that, since art was once the writing on God's wall. I think that's the way you put it. And in that work, it seems you're somewhat skeptical about the function. Well, and you mentioned this at the outset in terms of, is anyone reading my work? Is it really worth all this effort I'm putting into it, and so forth? You know, how do you view the question of your writing, in, at least in terms of audience, and perhaps, and I know this is an impossible question, but I'll just say it, even in terms of, shall we say, legacy, in terms of future readers?
Yeah, those are such good questions. Yeah, I mean, while those poems are older, I think now they've grown into a belief more recently that writing is actually performance. It's performance art.
Mhm.
And also reading, I view as a type of performance. And so um, when I'm writing, and especially at the moment of publication, um, I view it now, yeah, just more as performance art, where my body isn't necessarily present, but there is a space on the page that is a room or a dimension that is being activated through the presence of language and through the function of the reader themselves.
Mhm.
So writing is performance, but then I'm always interested in what is practice. If performance is the work or the thing, I'm more interested in the practice or the rehearsal or the thing that's pre-performance. And for me, we were talking a bit about this in our workshop. Like, I think maybe when I'm talking to myself, maybe the oral is actually pre-writing, and the talking to myself, that I either, if I'm talking to myself, I guess I don't capture. I don't like audio record myself in the bathroom or something. But I think my moments of self-talk are actually my best writing, perhaps. My most interesting writing to me, and most, even to use a slippery word, authentic. Um, and so I'm interested a lot about, I guess, sound, or in the reference that you drew, like if we are finding these cave paintings or these paintings and dwellings inside, what do they communicate or write? What type of literacy is necessary to understand them? Or a more expansive view of literacy that doesn't necessarily include linguists, like the written word or the written dimension. Um, I like to think of writing and reading as expansively as possible. So like every day I'm reading. I'm reading the sky, I'm reading people's faces, I'm reading my partner's face, I'm reading like I'm constantly processing and reading and developing and utilizing different types of literacies. And I'm never also not writing. So even though I'm not physically transcribing our interview right now, or physically writing, I'm engaging in a type of processing and a type of demonstration of what I would like to think of as writing. Um, and then in terms of legacy, is also a really loaded term for me because of my experience in libraries. Like, I went the other night, my partner and I, we went to his office at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we were leaving the office building, and there was a huge, one of those rolling garbage cart type things, full of books. And so, being the nerd that I am, I was like, oh, these are probably getting withdrawn. We should go pick through them, even though we're trying to downsize our books. So I went over to the cart, and it ended up being all of these books that Wisconsin has a information school, so a library studies program. They were all old books related to libraries from like the early 1900s onwards. So I'm sure are outdated or maybe have been digitized. There's no purpose to have them. So I picked two thin books to take home. But in terms of legacy, it's just like there's also this tension for me because of my librarian training, the numbers of books that we would withdraw, that we recycle or get rid of, or no one read, or they just sit on the shelf and collect. Like, if you're practically dealing with the handling of 20% of these books need to go bye-bye this year to make room for the new books. It's so devastating. It's like it becomes, and so I feel like I'm always picking through the graves, or I'm more called to like the graveyard of the discarded books that no one loved on. Like, no, this is still valuable. This is still like we could make cool aesthetic visual poems with this. I promise, like this is still worthy of our engagement. And so legacy is like this really tender, like through my librarian training, it's this very tender relationship with loss and even life cycle. Like I really view objects as containing an energy, and what we do in terms of reverence or irreverence for when we're done with something or when it no longer has value. And just grappling with the inability to have zero storage, like constantly when my iPhone is saying out of storage or storage at capacity, like how much can my mind actually hold? How much can my shelves actually hold before it's dwelling in hoarder territory? Or people are like, Alison, we're like, how much can I actually contain before it's overload? And I think having a grandmother, the same grandmother I referenced, have Alzheimer's the last years of her life, I was also as a young person grappling with how does this person that's so knowledgeable and powerful and such a matriarch deteriorate mentally, like not be able to recognize me, not be able to recognize how to get back home. Like how we talked about this in workshop, like if a person is constituted of memories, what happens to livelihood, to one's life, if those memories can't be preserved in a way that's like legible or functional, I guess, if you will. So I'm always chasing and trying to reconcile memory, I think, and what even constitutes a legacy, what is legible or illegible, or and also what is ephemeral, like what is private, like who has access to privacy. Yeah, I think that.
Okay, wow. Well, there's a lot to chew on there, and one of my follow-up questions on the first part of what you were talking about, in terms of the difference, writing is performative and reading is performative and so forth. And you talk about the fact that for you and you just mentioned this, that thinking of writing and reading as in the most expansive way possible, that obviously has to integrate not just the body, but also the mind and the emotions. In other words, to try to be as holistic as possible when you're engaging a work, or you're creating a work. So reading or writing, and that, or doing that verbal, pre-written, pre-publication, thing that we all do when we're processing, we're trying out different strategies. And for a lot of writers, that's often a lot more, and you sort of hinted at this, that's a lot more interesting than the actual published work, because the published work sort of freezes that. And so, my two thoughts about this is because of when I was a college journalist, and I talked to a lot of musicians, and I'm sure a lot of people have read this too, that a lot of musicians talk about the fact that when they perform live, that's actually the most authentic creation of music. When it gets reproduced, when it gets recorded, that for them is sort of, very unsatisfactory, because that's just one performance. Whereas when they're performing live, as we know, if you've ever seen live concerts, bands, change tempo, they change rhythms, they sometimes change lyrics, depending on the type of music we're talking about. And so recording can be very disappointing in that way. And I've talked to a lot of writers who feel the same way about publication, that the writing, I've talked, you may have had this experience, that a book, your book that you've been struggling for, months, years on, finally gets published. And immediately the thing you want to do is go back in there and change some things. You can't, because it's too late. But you have this sense, no, I now, later I want to change this word or change that, or so how do you do you have to let go, as it were, in terms of saying, okay, that's just one thing. That's not everything about this particular work, but it's just one facet of it.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday in workshop in terms of an argument that I've shown, I think, last residency, a belief that like if we believe that all writing is miscommunication, then there can be a successful or an unsuccessful miscommunication, but it's all a miscommunication. So I think it's helpful for me to view all books as failures, including my own. There's different types of failures, but like they're all so that way the relationship to them is not that they're neat or perfected or done or complete or something. I think it's also really helpful as a student if you engage with things like Maggie Nelson's Bluets, for example, becomes like this canonical like this is a masterpiece, right? Like if you engage with things, it's like I couldn't possibly write Bluets. They become whereas for the writer themselves, it's like it's all fail, like they're all attempts, or they're all different processes of trying and falling short. And so to me, it's more freeing to view them as experiments, failed experiments, or like failed expeditions or something. And there's like field notes, or there's some type of product of that it took place, a record, if you will. But I don't really attach myself to some notion of static. And also I just get so blown away going to readings and engaging with people that are like, this is my relationship to the work, or this is what I saw, or this is what I heard. In that beautiful like translation exercise that Sarah and Alejandro did, it's like Sarah's music choice was spot on, but some of the images Alejandro couldn't even name why, but it was like, that's not right. So like it's this dance between also readers and audiences. And I also I really appreciate your point about like live musicianship. I last year attended a reading by the poet and musician Jerome Ellis. He spells his name with 5 J's. And he was visiting a classroom, and the class had already listened to his music, his latest album called The Clearing, and read the poetry manuscript that goes with it. And so they were like, we don't have to take time if you don't want to. If you don't want to perform live or like do work, we could just jump into conversation. And he said, no, I want to perform live too, because for me, this is me kind of reinterpolating what he said. He was like, live is if you have an herb garden, if you go out to the garden and you pull up garlic or chives or rosemary or something fresh, as opposed to preserved or what do you call it? Dried seasonings. Like dried rosemary still has the essence of, it's not rosemary, it still has that essence. But if you cook or prepare a meal or have something like sensory in terms of smell and eating, the taste of fresh herbs is so much more rich. And so he was talking about performance in that way, that the live experience is actually being not like Ziploc bagged or freeze dried or dried in that way, but it's actually the essence, the true essence of the thing. Right. And I found that really beautiful and interesting. And also like practice, like I do the live performance and then maybe we did a sound check, or maybe we practiced with the band, or things happened in practice that weren't for a audience or are not documented or considered the performance or the concert, that I'm also really intrigued by. Like, performers that are actually in their own world, which sounds cliche, but when there's not the gaze of audience or the contextualization of I'm on stage, what happens in those spaces too?
Well, your reference to gardening reminded me of some of the comments that Ross Gay has made, because he's a gardener. He loves his garden and so forth. And he obviously draws analogies between, working his garden and working on a poem. And then I mean, almost the same thing you said too, that for him, that, you know, that moment when you create a meal out of what you've been creating, you know, that's very rich and satisfying. But for him, and this goes back to that pretty verbal thing again, that the most important thing is not the consumption of the meal, but actually the preparation of it. You know, everything that's going into it is actually for him much more satisfying than the, you know, sit down and eat and so forth, which is sort of like what the reader does, right? The reader gets the book and consumes it and so forth. So yeah, that's a very interesting and I think productive analogy in terms of thinking about these issues. Let me see if I had anything else that I wanted to ask you. Well, I know I joked with you yesterday about the bees, you know, the bell and the box and so forth. And even though I was joking a little bit, but I know that as writers, and in fact, I was to just before we came on, I was looking at this interview with Gerald Stern. I didn't read it entirely, but he was talking about what he calls accidental beginnings of poems. That poems often begin with a snippet of conversation, a word, a thought, a syllable, even a letter. And we find ourselves sort of, you know, following that crumb, if you will, and then it leads us to, you know, something else in the woods, so to speak. So boxes, bells, you know, birds, is this purely accidental, or do you find, and this might not even be conscious, so you might not be able to respond, but is there something about your following the letter B in these recent works that you're working out? Or is this purely, I mean, it could also be, you know, something like, I'm thinking about Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Bells, the bells, the bells, you know, so just playing with the sound of that word.
Yeah, when you asked me that yesterday, I was thinking about maybe like Harriet Mullen sleeping with the dictionary, or my relationship to language as a type of magic. Um, yeah, I recently saw the poet and musician Marvin Tate perform um, in two different settings, actually, once in London and one in Chicago. And he has a work called, I think it's called The N Word. And I had an opportunity to talk to him about it. And he was like, it was born out of having a daughter. And we would play this game where we would come up with words that start with certain letters. And so when we would do N, I would drop words like Nantucket, or like, no, like, you know, I would try to flex in terms. And so we had this just imaginative game. And then as an adult, words become quite loaded, or as you are maturing or, you know, shaping a child, it's like suddenly, you know, don't say the F word, or, you know, mommy says the F word at home, but don't say that at school, or, you know, the B word is bad, you know, these words that everyone knows what is implied or inferred, but you actually don't say. It's the polite or respectable thing to silence the word, to not activate it through speech, but we all know what is being inferred. And so I have a poem in one of my new manuscripts where I'm like exploring like beware of certain words that start with certain letters, or like a fixation on letters, I guess. And even in your phrasing, I like that of like accidental beginnings. I'm always really curious about how every time we start something, contained in that start is infinite stops or infinite endings or failures. So if I start with the letter A, I foreclose the possibilities of the rest of the alphabet, both in English and otherwise. Or like, so every start also contains a variety of endings, which for me is actually a type of grieving process that I think sometimes maybe writers don't name. Like, it feels really good to begin and end a book, but you also then have to simultaneously grieve all the other combinations or configurations that could have occurred for that beginning and ending that you kind of actively killed. Like
Right.
to give birth to that, you killed
Right.
all these other cool possibilities. Sometimes even like readers will be like, damn, why didn't I think of that? That would have been a much doper ending. Like, great. Like, so yeah, it's like, and I don't know that any of the beginnings are accidental. Like we've been talking in workshop a lot about like intuition
Mhm.
versus intentionality, or
Mhm.
like leading into a work with a particular frame, like dead set on we're going to do it this way, versus letting yourself be guided by feelings or just intuitive like vibes, if you vibrations, if you will. And
Mhm.
so wherever I turn my gaze can be like coincidental or it can feel accidental, but I do think it's infused by the lens of me, which I am the authority on that. Like I'm actually in some ways controlling. So I'd be curious, like rating accidental beginnings or entries into art, like how accidental are they on a scale of something to something? Because I feel like there are curious ways about tracing why our gaze is directed certain places, how much freedom we give ourselves to explore. Um, like I love when I'm working on prose to read only books in translation. I
Mhm.
don't actually have the ability to read books fully in other languages, but there's something intensely rich that happens for me when I'm reading things in translation while writing prose. I don't know why, and I don't have the expertise, like the official expertise of translation to maybe explore that, but um I don't know. Yeah, I don't know, beginnings and
But
endings are
well,
fascinating.
part of the reason I got interested in that, why that phrase sort of struck me when I saw it, is because I have had the experience of not me, because you're right. I don't think any writer. Well, I guess it could happen. I guess you could misread or misinterpret your own writing, or note that you've made and misread it, and then that leads you into a different direction than you thought you were going to go.
Hmm.
But um, in the one case I'm thinking about, and for me, is a couple of years ago. I'm trying to remember how this happened. Um, I know I was writing an essay, and do you know the poet Savan Patel? Do you know?
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Okay, so it was. I mean, it's a long story, but she was editor of the Georgia Review, and I was writing an essay for her for this thing, and I was writing about. I think I used the phrase something like, "Oh, I know." I referred to Michelle Alexander's the new Jim Crow, right?
Mhm.
In the context of this essay. And she wrote back, she said, "Oh, I misinterpreted. I thought you had written the new Him Crow,
Hmm.
talking about issues of transgender and queer identity." And she wrote a little haha next to it and so forth. But for me, I said, "That's great." So I actually worked on right upon, based upon that error, that mistake, her misreading, and so forth. And it took me in a whole different direction. This poem, about the new him crow. Um, uh, so I think that's what I was thinking about when I saw that phrase from Gerald Stern about accidental beginnings. Not for me, but when other readers, and I'm sure you've had this, like other readers, you know, you might their interpretation of a work, or you think, well, that's not what I was quote unquote thinking or feeling, but then you think, but that takes me off in this other direction too, if that makes any sense.
No, that totally makes sense. Yeah, I think it's one of the greatest gifts we can give people in a healthy workshop setting or in our, chosen writer family is to have that other set of perspectives or those slippages or misreadings, misinterpretations that actually act as revelatory to us or illuminate something that was non-illuminated before. Like I think it really is an incredible gift because I'm not capable of accessing it myself, like
Right,
dependent on
right.
others.
because we're, when we, even if we're just jotting down random phrases or words or syllables and so forth, and it seems completely random, but as you said, something in us obviously is driving those quote unquote random selections and so
Yeah.
forth. And they drive, as you said, and every time we make a selection, it closes off another door, as it were.
Yeah. In a more menacing way, also, like that line of thought, Tyrone, makes me think about how if I'm moving from poetry to nonfiction, specifically essays,
Mm-hmm.
in the realm of poetry, my misremembering or people's misinterpretations often for me has far lower stakes. If I'm writing an essay, um, suddenly it's like it gets very real. Like suddenly my ability to properly represent certain people's or tell the truth from different people's perspectives becomes really loaded in ways that I'm really fascinated by as well. I remember doing this. I had done this survival course in Arizona for a period for a nonfiction manuscript I'm working on. So I lived like off the grid for close to 2 weeks. No phone, no radio, no internet. Um, it was very intense for another time. And I got back from it and I received an email from my ex-husband, not my current husband, telling me that the poetry book, like they felt that everything I was saying or the things related to some of the topics, the traumas in the book were verifiably false, was the phrasing they used. And so I found it both really jarring and curious. I was like, oh, like, so no one even cares. Poetry, it's like no one it's the speaker. You should know that how curious. So then what is going to happen in the realm of essay where I'm beholden to certain like ethical standards of nonfiction? And then if you thought that was verifiably false, like you thought the poetry, like what is going, so it was curious to me. Like I think my home base, my home plate is always poetry because for me it is the most expansive, the most freeing, expressive form of the literary arts. And so I think about the ways when I switch the frame to essay, for example, what happens as it relates to even like accidental beginnings. Like if I foreclose, because you said you were working on an essay for that project or a poem.
It was an essay. Yeah, it was an essay.
Yeah. I'm curious if that slippage would have been different or this, like if it was a poetry or a poem.
Yeah, I won't say much more except because it was actually a very frustrating process where I was working with two editors who themselves were fighting over their expectations for the essay. Really? And so I got caught up in that as it were. And it was an essay on ecopoetics, and it was very much about the way that Sondheim and this, I'll just say this, she was supposed to be the new editor of this journal, and this person was supposed to be the departing editor, but the departing editor still wanted to have control over what would be the last issue, so sure. So they were butting heads, and then so I would get these reports from about the essay, and she would say this is great, and he would say throw it out, it's garbage, So that was that particular thing, but that happened. But I think obviously one difference between the essay, which is supposed to be nonfiction, is that you're dealing with quote unquote real people in their real lives and so forth, as opposed to poetry, where even if there are real personas in historical personas, actual verifiable people give you a lot more leeway with poetry. Like, okay, well, it's a poem, so you can do whatever. But in yeah, in nonfiction, you can't, the assumption at least is that you have to, you have to stick to quote unquote the facts, which makes, I mean, that's what makes to me the Birds of Prey essay so, so crucial because what are the facts there? Is your grandmother's, I'm sorry, your mother's insistence that it doesn't matter about a Harris Hawk or any other kind of falcon, that the spirit of her mother is in these, and the expert, as opposed to the expert, falconry person who says, well, clearly you know nothing about birds and nothing about falcons because, you're mixing up these two. Those are two different, jarring, confronting levels of knowledge, right? And which one you choose depends on, what you want to believe or need to believe.
Yeah, yeah. And that selection, I feel like so often we want to believe that selection is singular. We want to have one variable equal one thing.
Right.
People are often very opposed or very unsettled by this variable has 3+ possibilities in the
Right.
same, like this. So that's what often gets slippery, is like you can insert a red-tailed hawk and there's 5, like science, the Western sensibilities about like standardization, normative centers don't allow for multiplicity. Like it falls apart.
Right.
And so, yeah, what is the possibility for the multiple modes of knowledge? Or how dope would it be if, like, for the essay example you gave, Tyrone, like there were 2 versions of that spoke to those 2 editors' sensibilities, rather than making an editor invisible, or like
Right.
on the cover of the magazine it'll say edited by such and such, and then there's this invisible set of hands and eyes that maybe really shaped and molded and changed what you, Tyrone Williams, had even envisioned, but the editor, the publisher, all these people become invisible, and it's just, this is the final product, and we don't show our work like you do in math to get bonus points if you get the wrong answer. So it's like, if you didn't rock with this version, it's because here are 2 actually differing editors' opinions of what actually was the final thing.
Yeah, and I think about that too, especially since you brought the issue of editors. God, what's the black, what's her name? The black woman novelist who just recently, after many years, The Bird Watcher, just published a new book after many years of silence, as it were.
I'm not sure.
I can't think of her name now, but she worked with Toni Morrison.
Gail Jones, Jay's author.
Yeah, thank you,
Okay.
Gail Jones. And she said in an interview that she was quote unquote joking, but she said about one of her previous books that she said it had so much editing from Morrison that on some levels it's as much her novel as it is Gail Jones' novel, which of course raises the question that you're asking there about the author, particularly for books that have been heavily edited. How much of that is, maybe, to be honest, to be transparent, it should say by Toni Morrison and Gail Jones. But of course, that's not the way the industry works. Today it has to be by usually a singular author, and the editor, as you say, is invisible in the background, except for people who know that, about that work that went on behind the scenes, as it were. We could take that could take us into, Black women working behind the scenes in terms of so many different things in culture, American life and so forth, but that might take us too far afield. Now let me ask you, were there any last things that you wanted to say that about your own work and maybe its relationship to your pedagogy?
Yeah. Well, I think, when you were just mentioning those comments, I was thinking about Sarah's mic drop of creative writing industrial complex yesterday.
Right.
that led into our workshop discussion of that term and the repercussions of that complex, in relationship to your point about like, yeah, the complex, the industrial complex or capitalism, often publishers want it to be a singular author. This was published by, even I have books to my earlier point about translation that won't have, some will have the translator's name on the cover, some that you have to kind of look on the back, or it's later that the translator is even mentioned. And it's really a gift of the translator that I could even read it in my native language. So it's something I've been thinking about a lot in teaching, because a lot of times we're given so much power as the educator, as the faculty member. If I attach a value judgment to a student's work, often they believe, like I'm given so much authority, which I'm constantly trying to like make apparent or show I don't want, or like try to make a more equitable exchange. But I do think like I am a product, which is why a lot of my work, particularly poetry, is heavy in illusion. People are like, you have so many references, or the notes section is pages, because it's not just me. I'm a filter or a vessel through, and it's not just people that are living. Like I am processing and filtering a variety of different frames of energy, vibration, essence across time, across life forms. Like I couldn't do this today without my computer, literally. And so she is a part, like it's not an object devoid of essence or energy that is just in service of my humanity and nothing else. And I can't wait to get a new one. Like I really try to, even if I can't logistically publish Alison C. Rollins at all, or with like 11 names that come behind my name on the book, at least for myself, or when I'm giving readings or in the notes section, or as much as I can, I do try to give roses, if you will, or sing praises, or talk always about at least a dialectic or a symphony or like a polyvocal experience. And I find it a much more rewarding way to create and teach. I'm never also like not a student. I am authorized in certain spaces to be an educator, and so forth. I have certain responsibilities, but I never take off my student of curiosity hat ever. So, and that's being informed and infinite. Like I couldn't even begin to document all the different ways, consciously and subconsciously. And so I just always have a lot of things to chew on, a lot of things that I'm chasing in terms of curiosity. And I realize I'm part of a larger fabric, that it's always being woven. It's not a singular, one-dimensional process.
Okay. I think we're at one. Well, thank you. This has been very rich and provocative. I mean, first of all, it's leading to so many more questions, but we don't have time for those right now. But thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Tyrone.
Sure.
Tyrone and Alison, thank you so much. What a great conversation. Wow, let's give them a round of applause. All right, we have workshop in 59 minutes.